The morning mist hung heavy over the ancient castle of Ravenshire, as Prince Alexander stood at the window of his private chambers. His hands trembled slightly as he held the official document that would change everything. The royal seal gleamed in the pale sunlight, but its usual golden luster seemed dull today. Behind him, Princess Isabella sat in silence, her wedding ring catching the light as she twisted it nervously around her finger. The kingdom of Eldoria had never faced such a crisis in its 1,000-year history. What had started as whispers in the corridors of power had now become a roar that could no longer be ignored. The ancient laws that governed their realm were clear, and there was no escape from what must be done. Alexander had always known this day might come, but knowing and accepting were two very different things. Isabella rose from her chair, her silk gown rustling softly as she moved to stand beside her husband. They had been married for 15 years, partners in love and duty, but today felt like the end of everything they had built together. The weight of their shared silence filled the room like a physical presence. Outside, the castle grounds were already bustling with activity, as servants prepared for what would be the most significant day in Eldoria's recent history. The letter had arrived 3 days ago, delivered by a messenger whose face was grim with the knowledge of its contents. The Council of Elders had made their decision after months of deliberation. The ancient prophecy that had guided their kingdom for centuries was finally coming to pass, and Alexander and Isabella were at its center. They had always known their reign would be different, but they never imagined it would end like this. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the stone floors, Alexander finally spoke. His voice was steady, but Isabella could hear the pain beneath his calm exterior. He had spent sleepless nights trying to find another way, consulting with advisors, historians, and even mystics, but every path led to the same conclusion. The prophecy was clear, and their duty to the kingdom was absolute. Isabella placed her hand gently on Alexander's shoulder, feeling the tension in his muscles. She had always been his strength, the one who could calm his fears and ease his burdens. But today she too was struggling with the weight of what lay ahead. They had always faced challenges together, from political uprisings to natural disasters, but this was different. This was not just about their reign or their kingdom. It was about their very souls. The castle bells began to toll, their deep resonant sound echoing across the valley below. It was the signal they had been dreading, the call that would summon them to fulfill their destiny. Alexander folded the document carefully and placed it in his breast pocket, close to his heart. Isabella straightened her shoulders, drawing on the inner strength that had made her beloved by the people of Eldoria. Together, they walked toward the door that would lead them to the great hall where their subjects waited. The hallways seemed longer today, each step echoing with the weight of history. Portraits of past rulers looked down upon them from the walls, their painted eyes seeming to offer both encouragement and warning. The legacy of their ancestors had always been a source of pride, but now it felt like a chain that bound them to an inescapable fate. As they reached the massive oak doors of the great hall, Alexander paused and turned to face Isabella. Without words, they shared a moment that spoke of all their years together, all their hopes and dreams, and all the sacrifices they had made for their people. The love in their eyes was undimmed by the trials they faced, a beacon of light in the darkness that surrounded them. The doors opened, and the sound of 1,000 voices fell silent as the royal couple entered the hall. The nobility of Eldoria had gathered along with representatives from every corner of the kingdom. Foreign dignitaries sat alongside common folk who had traveled for days to witness this historic moment. The air was thick with anticipation and sorrow, for everyone present understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. Alexander and Isabella walked slowly down the center aisle, their heads held high despite the emotional storm raging within their hearts. The ancient throne room had witnessed countless ceremonies over the centuries, but none as profound as this. At the far end of the hall, the archbishop waited with the sacred texts that would guide the ceremony. His face was solemn, reflecting the weight of the role he was about to play in this historic moment. As they approached the altar where their fate awaited, Alexander felt Isabella's hand slip into his. Their fingers intertwined one last time, a final gesture of unity before they would be forever changed. The prophecy that had shaped their lives was about to reach its conclusion, and there was no turning back from the path that lay before them. The archbishop's voice resonated through the great hall as he began reciting the ancient words that had been spoken only once before in Eldoria's history. The prophecy, written in the old language, spoke of a time when the realm would face its greatest challenge, and its rulers would be called upon to make the ultimate sacrifice for their people. Alexander and Isabella stood perfectly still, their eyes fixed on the ornate manuscript from which the holy man read. The crowd in the great hall remained silent, but the tension was palpable. Many had traveled from distant villages, leaving their homes and families behind to witness this moment. Farmers stood next to merchants, soldiers beside scholars, all united in their reverence for the royal couple who had served them faithfully for so many years. The diversity of the gathering spoke to the deep respect Alexander and Isabella had earned throughout their reign. As the ceremony continued, memories flooded through Isabella's mind. She remembered their wedding day, when they had stood in this very hall surrounded by joy and celebration instead of sorrow. The young woman she had been then could never have imagined that their love story would lead to this moment. Yet she felt no regret, only a deep sense of purpose that had grown stronger with each passing year of their marriage. Alexander's thoughts turned to their children, Prince Marcus and Princess Helena, who were watching from the royal balcony above. The pain in their young faces was almost unbearable to witness, but he knew they understood the importance of what was happening. They had been raised to serve their kingdom above all else, and today they were seeing the ultimate example of that service. The future of Eldoria would rest in their capable hands. The ceremony reached its crucial moment as the Archbishop presented the Crown of Sorrows, an ancient artifact that had been created specifically for this purpose. Legend told that it had been forged from the tears of the first Queen of Eldoria, who had foreseen this day in her dreams. The crown was beautiful but terrible to behold, its silver surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and move in the flickering candlelight. As Alexander knelt to receive the crown, a profound change came over the assembled crowd. What had begun as a ceremony of duty was transforming into something deeper and more meaningful. The people of Eldoria were witnessing not just the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy, but the demonstration of love so pure and selfless that it transcended earthly concerns. Isabella's tears flowed freely now, but they were tears of pride as much as sorrow. The weight of the crown of sorrows settled upon Alexander's head, and immediately he felt the change it brought. The ancient magic woven into its silver bands began to work, connecting him to every soul in the kingdom. He could feel their hopes, their fears, their unwavering faith in the sacrifice he and Isabella were making. The burden was overwhelming, but it was also a gift beyond measure. Isabella stepped forward to receive her own sacred ornament, the amulet of eternal devotion. As it was placed around her neck, she felt a warm glow spread through her entire being. The amulet had the power to preserve the love between her and Alexander, even as they were separated by forces beyond their control. Their bond would transcend the physical realm and become something eternal and unbreakable. The Archbishop raised his hands, and his voice grew stronger as he spoke the final words of the ancient ritual. The prophecy foretold that when Eldoria faced its darkest hour, its rulers would willingly give up their earthly forms to become guardians of the realm. They would sacrifice their physical existence to protect their people from a great evil that threatened to consume the entire kingdom. As the words echoed through the hall, a strange light began to emanate from the royal couple. It started as a faint glow around their heads, but quickly spread to encompass their entire bodies. The assembled crowd gasped in wonder and terror as they witnessed the beginning of the transformation that would save their kingdom. Alexander and Isabella remained calm, their hands clasped tightly together as they prepared for what was to come. The light grew brighter, and the air in the great hall began to shimmer with an otherworldly energy. Ancient tapestries on the walls seemed to come alive, their woven figures moving and dancing in the supernatural radiance. The very stones of the castle appeared to pulse with life, as if the building itself was awakening to witness this momentous event. Foreign dignitaries who had traveled from distant lands to observe the ceremony found themselves overwhelmed by emotions they could not understand. This was not just a political event or a religious ritual. It was a demonstration of love and sacrifice that transcended all boundaries of culture and belief. Many fell to their knees, overcome by the sheer power of what they were witnessing. Prince Marcus and Princess Helena watched from above, their faces a mixture of pride and heartbreak. They had always known their parents were special, but today they truly understood the depth of their sacrifice. The knowledge that Alexander and Isabella were willingly giving up their lives to protect the kingdom filled the young royals with both inspiration and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. The transformation was accelerating now, and Alexander and Isabella began to feel their physical forms becoming lighter, more ethereal. They could sense the great evil approaching the borders of Eldoria, a darkness so complete that it threatened to swallow not just their kingdom, but the entire world. Only their sacrifice could create a barrier strong enough to hold it back, protecting future generations from unimaginable horror. The transformation continued as the ethereal light surrounding Alexander and Isabella grew more intense. Their physical forms were becoming translucent, like figures made of moonlight and starshine. Yet their love for each other and their people burned brighter than ever, creating a warmth that could be felt throughout the great hall. The assembled crowd watched in awe as their beloved rulers began their journey from the mortal realm to something far greater. As the ancient magic worked its way through their beings, Alexander and Isabella began to see visions of Eldoria's future. They witnessed the great darkness that was approaching, a force of pure evil that had already consumed 3 neighboring kingdoms. The shadow armies were massive, led by creatures from nightmares that no ordinary weapon could defeat. Only the barrier created by their sacrifice would be strong enough to protect their people from this terrible fate. The archbishop continued his chanting, but his voice was now joined by an otherworldly chorus that seemed to come from the very air around them. The spirits of past rulers had gathered to witness this moment, their ghostly forms barely visible in the supernatural light. They had all served Eldoria in their time, but none had been called upon to make such a profound sacrifice. Alexander and Isabella were entering a realm of honor reserved for the greatest of heroes. In the royal balcony above, Prince Marcus felt his father's eyes meet his own across the vast distance that was growing between them. Without words, Alexander conveyed his final instructions to his son. Marcus would rule with wisdom and compassion, guided by the principles his parents had taught him. The young prince straightened his shoulders, accepting the weight of the crown that would soon be his to bear. Princess Elena reached for her brother's hand, drawing strength from their shared resolve. She had always been the more adventurous of the 2 siblings, but today she understood that true courage sometimes meant standing still and accepting what could not be changed. Her parents were showing her the ultimate example of bravery, and she would carry their lesson with her for the rest of her life. The magical transformation was reaching its climax as Alexander and Isabella's earthly forms began to fade completely. But instead of disappearing, they were becoming something new and wonderful. Their love was transforming into a living force that would protect Eldoria for all eternity. The barrier they were creating would be invisible to the naked eye, but its power would be absolute. Throughout the kingdom, people felt the change beginning to take effect. Farmers working in distant fields paused in their labors as a sense of peace and protection washed over them. Soldiers on the borders stood straighter as they felt an invisible shield forming around their homeland. Children stopped their play to look up at the sky, somehow understanding that something miraculous was happening at the castle. The great evil that had been approaching Eldoria suddenly found its advance halted. The shadow armies crashed against an invisible wall that burned them with pure light. Their terrible screams echoed across the wastelands as they were forced back, unable to comprehend the power that now protected the kingdom. The Dark Lord who commanded them raged in fury, but even his ancient magic was no match for the barrier created by true love and sacrifice. Back in the Great Hall, the final moments of the ceremony were upon them. Alexander and Isabella were now barely visible, their forms consisting more of light than flesh. But their voices could still be heard as they spoke their final words to their people. They promised to watch over Eldoria forever, to be the guardian spirits that would protect future generations from any evil that might threaten their homeland. The crowd began to weep openly as they realized they were witnessing the last moments they would see their beloved rulers in physical form. These were not tears of despair, however, but tears of gratitude and overwhelming love. Alexander and Isabella had given them the greatest gift possible, the assurance that their children and grandchildren would live in safety and peace. As the transformation neared completion, the royal couple's love created a beautiful display of colors that danced through the air above the assembled crowd. Each person present felt touched by this divine light, blessed by the sacrifice they were witnessing. The foreign dignitaries would return to their own lands with stories of this miracle, spreading word of Eldoria's courage throughout the known world. The archbishop raised his staff one final time, and his voice rang out with the concluding words of the ancient prophecy. He spoke of the eternal guardians who would watch over the kingdom and of the love that would never die. The ceremony was complete, but its effects would resonate through the ages. Alexander and Isabella had achieved immortality not through conquest or treasure, but through the purity of their devotion to each other and their people. The light began to settle into the very stones of the castle, infusing the ancient walls with a protective power that would endure forever. Eldoria itself was being transformed, becoming a beacon of hope in a world increasingly threatened by darkness. The kingdom would stand as an example to all nations of what could be achieved when love and duty combined in perfect harmony. As the supernatural radiance gradually faded, the great hall fell silent once more. But this was not the silence of ending. It was the profound quiet that comes after witnessing something truly sacred. Every person present knew they had been part of history, witnesses to an act of love so pure that it had literally changed the world around them. In the profound silence that followed the completion of the ceremony, something extraordinary began to happen. Though Alexander and Isabella were no longer visible in their physical forms, their presence could still be felt throughout the great hall. A gentle warmth filled the air, and many in the crowd reported feeling as though invisible hands were touching their shoulders in comfort and blessing. The royal couple had not truly left. They had simply transcended to a higher plane of existence. Prince Marcus stepped forward from the royal balcony, his face pale but determined. At only 19 years old, he was about to become the youngest king in Eldoria's history. But the wisdom in his eyes spoke of someone far older. The weight of the crown that awaited him was nothing compared to the legacy his parents had just created. He knew that ruling a kingdom protected by such a powerful sacrifice would be both an honor and an enormous responsibility. The archbishop, still glowing faintly from his proximity to the supernatural transformation, approached the altar where the crown of Eldoria rested. This was not the crown of sorrows that Alexander had worn during the ceremony, but the traditional crown of kings, passed down through generations. As he lifted it, the ancient gold seemed to shimmer with new energy, as if it too had been blessed by the sacrifice it had just witnessed. Princess Elena followed her brother down from the balcony, her own role in the kingdom's future becoming clearer with each step. Though she would not wear a crown, she would serve as her brother's most trusted advisor, helping him navigate the complex challenges that lay ahead. The siblings had always been close, but the events of this day had forged an unbreakable bond between them that would serve Eldoria well in the years to come. As Marcus knelt before the archbishop to receive his crown, a most remarkable thing occurred. For just a moment, the ghostly figures of Alexander and Isabella appeared beside their son, their hands resting on his shoulders as the crown was placed upon his head. The assembled crowd gasped in wonder, and many fell to their knees in reverence. The new king had been blessed by his transformed parents, marking the beginning of a reign that would be guided by their eternal wisdom. The coronation of King Marcus was unlike any in Eldoria's history. The usual fanfare and celebration were replaced by a solemn acknowledgement of the sacrifice that had made this moment possible. When the archbishop proclaimed him king, the entire kingdom seemed to respond. Church bells rang from every village, and a gentle rain began to fall, as if the very heavens were weeping tears of joy for the new monarch. In the days that followed, the effects of Alexander and Isabella's transformation became more apparent. The kingdom's borders, once vulnerable to attack, now seemed impenetrable. Soldiers reported that their weapons felt lighter and their courage stronger whenever they patrolled the frontier. Crops grew more abundant, and sick children recovered with remarkable speed. Eldoria was being protected and blessed by forces beyond human understanding. King Marcus established a new tradition to honor his parents' sacrifice. Every year on the anniversary of their transformation, the people of Eldoria would gather in the Great Hall for a ceremony of remembrance. During these gatherings, many reported seeing brief glimpses of the former royal couple, always together, always watching over their beloved kingdom with love and pride. The barrier that protected Eldoria became legendary throughout the known world. Other kingdoms, still struggling against the forces of darkness, sent ambassadors to learn the secret of Eldoria's protection. King Marcus would always tell them the same thing. True protection came not from walls or armies, but from leaders willing to sacrifice everything for their people's well-being. The Dark Lord, who had been turned back by the barrier, made several more attempts to breach Eldoria's defenses, but each effort proved futile. The power created by Alexander and Isabella's love was absolute and eternal. Eventually, the evil forces turned their attention to easier targets, leaving Eldoria as an island of peace in an increasingly troubled world. As months passed, King Marcus proved himself to be a worthy successor to his parents. He ruled with the same compassion and wisdom they had shown, always remembering that his crown came not from birthright alone, but from the ultimate sacrifice made by those who had worn it before him. His decisions were often guided by dreams in which Alexander and Isabella appeared to offer counsel and comfort. The people of Eldoria flourished under their new king's rule, but they never forgot the price that had been paid for their peace. Statues of Alexander and Isabella were erected in every town square, not as monuments to the dead, but as reminders of the living guardians who continued to watch over them. Children grew up hearing stories of their sacrifice, learning that true nobility came from service to others. Foreign scholars came to study the phenomenon that protected Eldoria, but none could fully explain the magic that had been created. Some attributed it to ancient spells, others to divine intervention. The truth was simpler and more profound than any of their theories. Love, when pure enough and willing to sacrifice everything, could indeed work miracles that surpassed all understanding. Princess Helena established schools throughout the kingdom where children could learn not just reading and mathematics, but the principles of leadership and service that their parents had embodied. She wanted to ensure that future generations would understand the responsibility that came with their protected status, and that they would be prepared to make their own sacrifices if called upon to do so. The transformation had changed more than just the royal family. It had elevated the entire kingdom to a higher purpose. Eldoria became known as a place where justice prevailed, where the weak were protected, and where love was valued above all earthly treasures. Pilgrims began arriving from distant lands, seeking to experience the peace that could only be found within the kingdom's blessed borders. The final confrontation came on a night when the moon was dark and the stars seemed to hide behind thick clouds. The Dark Lord himself had come to Eldoria's borders, no longer content to work through agents and corruption. His presence was so powerful that it created a zone of absolute shadow around the kingdom's perimeter, where no light could penetrate and hope itself seemed to die. King Marcus felt the approaching evil before any of his sentries reported it. The protective barrier that had shielded Eldoria for 5 years began to shimmer and strain under the direct assault of such concentrated malevolence. For the first time since his parents' transformation, the young king wondered if their sacrifice would be enough to protect the kingdom from this ultimate test. Throughout Eldoria, people sensed the approaching danger. Children woke crying from nightmares while adults felt an inexplicable dread settling over their hearts. But rather than flee or despair, the citizens of the kingdom did something remarkable. They began to gather in the streets, holding hands and sharing stories of the love and sacrifice that had protected them for so long. Princess Helena stood with her brother on the highest tower of the castle, watching as the darkness pressed against their borders. The barrier was holding, but they could see cracks beginning to form in the supernatural light that protected them. The Dark Lord's power was greater than anything Alexander and Isabella had faced when they made their sacrifice, and it was testing the very limits of what love could accomplish. As the pressure on the barrier intensified, something unexpected began to happen. The spirits of Alexander and Isabella appeared not just to their children, but to everyone in the kingdom. Citizens throughout Eldoria reported seeing the former, rulers standing beside them, their faces filled with determination and unwavering love. The ghostly couple moved through the crowds, touching hearts and strengthening resolve. The Dark Lord, frustrated by the barrier's resistance, began to speak with a voice that carried across the entire kingdom. He offered King Marcus a bargain. Surrender Eldoria peacefully, and he would spare the lives of all its citizens. Refuse, and he would eventually break through the barrier and destroy everything the kingdom had built. King Marcus climbed to the very top of the castle's highest tower, where his voice could be heard throughout the land. His response to the Dark Lord's ultimatum was clear and unwavering. Eldoria would never surrender to evil, no matter the cost. The kingdom had been founded on principles of love, justice, and sacrifice, and those principles would guide them even in their darkest hour. As the king's words echoed across the land, a miraculous thing began to happen. The citizens of Eldoria, inspired by their ruler's courage and the presence of Alexander and Isabella's spirits, began to add their own power to the protective barrier. Their love for their kingdom, their gratitude for the sacrifice that had protected them, and their determination to preserve what was good in the world combined to strengthen the magical defenses. The barrier, which had been flickering and weakening under the Dark Lord's assault, suddenly blazed with renewed power. But this time, it was not just the love of two people protecting the kingdom. It was the combined love of every man, woman, and child within Eldoria's borders. The Dark Lord's attack was not just being repelled, it was being overwhelmed by a force he had never encountered before. For the first time in his ancient existence, the Dark Lord experienced something he had never known. Doubt. The power facing him was not the magic of spells or the strength of armies, but something far more fundamental and enduring. It was the power of an entire people united in their commitment to protecting what they held dear. The confrontation reached its climax as dawn broke over the kingdom. The first rays of sunlight struck the barrier, and the combined power of light and love created a wave of energy that swept outward from Eldoria's borders. The darkness that had surrounded the kingdom was not just pushed back. It was transformed, turned into pure light that spread across the surrounding lands. The Dark Lord himself was caught in this wave of transformation. His ancient evil, so concentrated and absolute, could not survive contact with such pure and selfless love. As the light touched him, he felt something he had forgotten over millennia of corruption, the memory of what he had been before darkness claimed him. For just a moment, he remembered love, hope, and the possibility of redemption. The transformation of the Dark Lord sent shockwaves throughout the supernatural world. His armies of shadow creatures, suddenly freed from his malevolent influence, began to remember their own origins. Many had once been ordinary people, corrupted and enslaved by evil forces. As the Dark Lord's power broke, they found themselves restored to their true nature, confused but grateful for their unexpected freedom. In Eldoria, the victory was celebrated not with triumphant fanfare, but with quiet gratitude and renewed dedication to the principles that had saved them. King Marcus and Princess Elena stood together in the great hall where their parents had made their ultimate sacrifice, feeling the presence of Alexander and Isabella more strongly than ever before. The former rulers appeared one final time to their children, their forms more solid and radiant than they had been since their transformation. They spoke words of pride and love, assuring Marcus and Elena that their sacrifice had achieved something beyond their wildest dreams. They had not just protected one kingdom, they had helped to heal the entire world. As the years passed, Eldoria became more than a protected kingdom. It became a center of learning and healing for the entire world. People came from every land to study the principles that had made such a victory possible. The story of Alexander and Isabella's sacrifice, and the love that had ultimately triumphed over absolute evil, inspired a new age of hope and cooperation among all nations. King Marcus ruled for many more years, always guided by the wisdom his parents had taught him and the example they had set. When his own time came to pass the crown to the next generation, he did so with the knowledge that Eldoria would continue to stand as a beacon of hope in the world, protected forever by the power of love that conquers all darkness. 5 years had passed since the Great Transformation, and Eldoria had become a beacon of hope in a world still plagued by darkness. King Marcus had grown into his role with remarkable grace, guided by the wisdom his parents had instilled in him and the subtle signs of their continued presence. The kingdom prospered unlike ever before, but with that prosperity came new challenges that would test the strength of the protective barrier created by Alexander and Isabella's sacrifice. On a crisp autumn morning, troubling news arrived at the castle. A messenger from the neighboring kingdom of Valenhall brought word that the dark forces, frustrated by their inability to penetrate Eldoria's defenses, had begun using new tactics. They were not attacking the barrier directly, but instead were corrupting the minds and hearts of people in surrounding lands, turning them against Eldoria through lies and manipulation. King Marcus convened his council immediately, with Princess Elena at his right hand. The news was more serious than it first appeared. Refugees from corrupted kingdoms were beginning to arrive at Eldoria's borders, and among them were spies and agents of the Dark Lord. The barrier protected against physical and magical attacks, but it could not prevent the entry of those who appeared to be innocent victims seeking sanctuary. As the council deliberated, a strange thing happened. The air in the chamber grew warm, and a gentle light began to emanate from the ancient tapestries on the walls. King Marcus felt a familiar presence, and he knew his parents were trying to communicate with him. Though they could no longer speak directly, their love and wisdom found ways to guide their son during his most challenging moments. Princess Elena, who had always been more sensitive to supernatural occurrences, suddenly stood and walked to the great window overlooking the kingdom. Her eyes grew distant, as if she were seeing something far beyond the physical landscape before her. When she spoke, her voice carried an unusual authority that commanded the attention of everyone present. She described a vision that had come to her in that moment, showing her the true nature of the threat they faced. The Dark Lord had learned that he could not destroy Eldoria through force, so he was attempting to corrupt it from within. His agents were already among the refugees, spreading doubt and discord, trying to weaken the bonds of love and trust that made the protective barrier so powerful. The council realized they faced a dilemma that would have challenged even Alexander and Isabella. How could they protect their kingdom without turning away genuine refugees who desperately needed their help? The solution would require wisdom, courage, and perhaps most importantly, the same kind of sacrifice that had created their protection in the first place. King Marcus made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Rather than closing the borders or implementing harsh screening measures, he announced that Eldoria would welcome even more refugees, but with a new condition. Every person seeking sanctuary would be required to participate in a ceremony of purification that would cleanse them of any dark influence, while allowing their true nature to shine through. The ceremony Marcus proposed was based on the same principles that had guided his parents' transformation. It required participants to open their hearts completely, to confess their fears and hopes, and to commit themselves to the values of love and service that protected Eldoria. Those with pure intentions would emerge blessed and strengthened, while those harboring evil would find themselves unable to complete the ritual. Princess Elena volunteered to oversee these ceremonies, drawing on the supernatural sensitivity she had developed since her parents' transformation. She could sense the true nature of each person who sought entry to their kingdom, distinguishing between genuine refugees and hidden agents of darkness. Her gift became a crucial tool in maintaining Eldoria's security without sacrificing its compassion. The first purification ceremony took place on the anniversary of Alexander and Isabella's transformation. As Princess Elena began the ritual, the entire castle seemed to come alive with spiritual energy. The ghostly figures of the former rulers appeared more clearly than they had since their transformation, standing beside their daughter as she worked to protect their kingdom. Among the refugees undergoing the ceremony was a young woman named Sarah, who had fled from a distant land where her entire family had been killed by shadow creatures. As she participated in the ritual, her genuine grief and desperate hope for a better life shone so brightly that it moved everyone present to tears. When the ceremony concluded, she bore a mark of blessing that would protect her from dark influences for the rest of her life. However, not all participants fared so well. 3 individuals among the group were revealed to be agents of the Dark Lord, their evil intentions becoming apparent when they were unable to complete the ritual. Rather than punishing them harshly, King Marcus offered them a choice. They could leave Eldoria immediately and never return, or they could undergo a more intensive purification process that might cleanse them of their corruption entirely. 2 of the agents chose to leave, recognizing that their Dark Master's power could not overcome the love that protected Eldoria. But the third, a young man who had been corrupted at a very early age, begged for the chance at redemption. His genuine desire to change touched the hearts of all present, and Princess Elena agreed to attempt the more intensive ritual. The redemption ceremony lasted 3 days and nights, with Princess Elena and a group of the kingdom's most spiritual advisors working tirelessly to cleanse decades of corruption from the young man's soul. On the final night, as they neared exhaustion, the spirits of Alexander and Isabella appeared once more, adding their power to the effort. When the ceremony concluded, the former agent had been completely transformed. The darkness that had consumed his soul was replaced by a radiant light that rivaled that of the royal family themselves. He became one of Eldoria's most devoted citizens, dedicating his life to helping other victims of corruption find their way back to the light. Word of these remarkable ceremonies spread throughout the known world, attracting even more refugees to Eldoria's borders. But it also drew the attention of the Dark Lord himself, who began to realize that his enemy was not just a protected kingdom, but a force that could actively work against his corruption. The final confrontation between light and darkness was drawing near.